It's so great to be here. It's so great to see so many of you. I need to thank Kate for the wonderful title, Thinking Historically in a Broken World. I'm really excited to talk to you today and tomorrow. And today, Jeremy and I are both going to be giving you mini history lessons. And I have to say that when I talk about apartheid, it usually takes me 14 weeks, 3 times a week in 50-minute slots. I'm going to give you 20 minutes now, and I might go a little fast, but I'll use the microphone, so I hope you can hear me. Yes. So apartheid, which you've heard about. I mean, many of you were here when I was here, and remember this being an issue we talked about at Calvin. Apartheid is the Dutch or the Afrikaans word for separateness. It was the policy of the South African state between 1948 and 1994, and it means racial segregation. And it's often symbolized by this sign. This is a sign you see when you find it on Google, on Wikipedia, but it was a lot more than Jim Crow type segregation. I'm going to be talking about that. I came to think about apartheid because when I was at Calvin, the first multicultural lecturer came, who was Alan Boussac, and I know some of you do remember him. And Wally Bratt said to me, "Nancy, you need to take this course." And I did, and it changed my life. So I learned about apartheid from him, and this was his book. So just to give you a context, that it was at Calvin in the early 80s when I first started to think about apartheid. Apartheid was segregation in 4 domains: rural, territorial, industrial, and urban residential, and political. Apartheid was systematizing race. There were officially 4 racial groups, and every person was classified officially with a document saying which racial group they belonged in. The first of the groups, with the largest population, were known alternatively as African or Native or Bantu. They were speakers of Bantu languages who historically had been agro-pastoralists, not the only indigenous people in the country, but those who were in the majority in the 20th century. Very diverse group, at least 3 quite different language families in the Bantu family, living in different environmental zones. The second group I will draw your attention to are the whites. And during my dates here are from 1951, they were about 20% of the population. And you should know that they were also split into 2 ethnic groups: those who were Afrikaans, who were descendants of the Dutch, who first arrived in 1652 with an outpost of the Dutch East India Company, and also English speakers who arrived in the 19th and the 20th century when South Africa was annexed to the British Empire. I'm not going to tell you about the other 2 groups, but these 2 major groups are really most involved in the story of apartheid. Okay, so the types of segregation. The first type of segregation is rural territorial segregation. In 1910, South Africa received its independence from Great Britain, and in 1913, 3 years later, they passed the most infamous piece of segregationist legislation, which is the Native Land Act. It divided the entire country by race and dictated what white people were allowed to own and what black people were allowed to own. And white people were given 87%, actually it wasn't even this 13% was later in 1936. We'll just focus on, by 1936, the way the land was divided was white people were allowed 87% of the population, at about 20%, 87% of the land at about 20% of the population, and African/natives were given 13% of the land for around 70% of the population. They were not allowed to purchase any land outside of that. That's the most hated piece of legislation even today. The next type of segregation is industrial segregation. And these are the laws that are passed right after South Africa becomes independent. Look, 1911, 1926, 1931. There was a jobs color bar and a wage color bar. Those are 2 different things. The jobs color bar is certain jobs can only be held by white people. Semi-skilled to skilled labor supervisory positions. Only white people were allowed to use dynamites on the mines in South Africa because of security issues. So that's the first issue, that white and black people aren't allowed to have the same jobs. The second issue is the wage color bar, which is just wages for unskilled black workers were kept very low. So these 2 pieces thoroughly segregated business and industry in South Africa. The third type of segregation is urban segregation. And yes, I'll talk about this again in a little bit, but neighborhoods were legally segregated. It's not a matter of redlining by banks, but it's a matter of maps being maps being divided into which areas different people are legally allowed to live in. Not only that, but black people, and in the early part of when these laws were first passed in the late 19th century, it was up to the municipalities, but urban areas could dictate that black people were required to have a pass on them at all times, because if they didn't have that pass on them, they could be stopped by the police, and they would not be able to demonstrate that they had a legal right to be in that space, and they could be deemed illegal and removed. Not that that sounds familiar. And also, also going on, the legally mandated neighborhoods. I want to say the first, one of the first boosts toward legally mandated segregated neighborhoods was when there was an outbreak of bubonic plague in Cape Town, and they determined that black people were carriers of bubonic plague, not rats, but black people, and they were segregated off to another area so the white people would be kept away from those that they were considered to be carriers of the disease. This was a public health measure. And the fourth type of segregation is political segregation. And this is indirect rule. If you've learned your African history, that this was a major principle of the British Empire, that Africans would be ruled through what the British considered to be traditional tribal structures. So in 1928, the Natives Affairs Act, in 1927, the Natives Administration Act determined that all of the black people would be ruled through their traditional chiefs. All right, so those history students among you, you're probably too polite, but at this point I would invite you to think of what I've done, which was inconsistent. Because I said to you that apartheid started in 1948, and everything I've just told you is pre-1948. So there was thoroughgoing segregation in South Africa since about 1900. But apartheid is what really caught people's attention, and apartheid was an intensification. So let's talk about that. Let's look at what happened in 1948. And this is where we became concerned when we were at Calvin in the 1980s, and where you might be interested, is that the Afrikaner Christian nationalism was built on neo-Calvinism, the same neo-Calvinism that people talk about. And I first learned about Christian nationalism about South Africa, and it's so frightening now to see it always coming back in discussions of the United States. All right, so in the 1930s, there was an upsurge of Christian nationalists among the Afrikaner people, and they built this monument outside of Pretoria called the Voortrekker Monument, which talked about their history. And the whole point of it was that Afrikaners were God's chosen people in Africa. Now, being God's chosen people anywhere is not a particularly original idea. A lot of people claim that. It becomes more specifically Calvinist, and I'll talk to you about that. Okay, so this is a quotation which might which I will talk about in a minute, which will become more familiar to you. God willed the diversity of peoples. Thus far, he has preserved the identity of our people. Such preservation was not for naught, for God allows nothing to happen for naught. He maintained the identity of our people. He has a fullest task for us, a calling laid away. On this, I base my fullest conviction that our people will again win back their freedom as a people. That sounds a little bit like predestination. It sounds a little bit like God's intention for a particular path in history. So you're starting to see the Calvinist overtones, and they become more specific. And Abraham Kuyper, whom we learned about at Calvin College, whom you're probably still talking about, Abraham Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty was ethnicized in South Africa. So here's another quotation. In every people in the world is embodied a divine idea, and the task of each people is to build upon that idea and to perfect it. Separate spheres are ethnic spheres, tribes. Oops, sorry. Not what I wanted to do. So God created the Afrikaner people with a unique language, a unique philosophy of life, and their own history and tradition in order that they might fulfill a particular calling and destiny here in the southern corner of Africa. So people were relating to God through their ethnic units, and God was relating to them through their ethnic definitions. We must stand guard on all that is peculiar to us and build on it. We must believe that God has called us to be servants of his righteousness in this place. We must walk the way of obedience and faith. So this is an imperative, a Christian imperative. And in 1948, for all kinds of reasons, and they did not receive a majority of the popular vote. However, in 1948, they won a majority of seats in Parliament, and the Afrikaner National Party moved into government, and they stayed in government until 1994, and they governed under the policy of apartheid separateness. And this is where apartheid becomes really distinctive. And segregation existed before, but segregation in South Africa becomes distinctive and particularly egregious now. So here, the post-1948 intensification. First off, I've talked to you about the pass laws and urban segregation. Here's an image of men who are applying for those passes. What the government did is they had a law that they called, they called it the Abolition of Passes Act. But what it did is it abolished municipal local passes and instituted a national pass. So every black man had to have a pass on his person at all times, and if he did not have it, he could be sent back to the rural area where his people ethnically belonged. Listen to this. It is accepted government policy that the Bantu are only temporarily resident in the European areas of the Republic for as long as they labor there. As soon as they become no longer fit for work or superfluous in the labor market, they are expected to return to the territory of their national unit where they fit ethnically. And this is the pass they had to carry. There you have it, the National Abolition of Passes Act. And here's an image. You saw this was a very common image in South Africa from the 40s through the 80s. Men are being checked, and if they don't have their passes, they're going to be arrested. Sometimes they're not actually sent back to where they come from. They're just meant to work for a little while for the profit of the state on a farm or something to contribute their labor. So this criminalized the black population, and eventually women also had to carry passes. For example, in 1967, nearly 700,000 black people were convicted of not carrying the pass they needed, and this is out of a population of 12 to 15 million people. So the population is being criminalized simply for not having the legal right to be in the cities which the state has deemed to be white. Also, the organization of space became much more systematic. Every city in the country was divided according to race, and the neighborhoods were set up, and if you were living in the wrong neighborhood, you would be removed. But this is where it gets really interesting. So this is the map that I showed you before of 1913 and 1936, the territory that was given for black people. Now, these were local reserves. They were reserves. They might have been a missionary reserve. They might have been an area that people were able to keep because they had a treaty with the British. They might be land that black farmers bought for themselves. It's got all different sorts of land. And they're all dealing with the local governments, the districts, the local districts. What the government did is they put together all of these segregated spaces with ethnic categories. So this whole sphere of sovereignty and the connection of ethnicity to divine will is operationalized in the space of the country. So here's a map. And this is a map showing different languages. And these languages are not all, they're all Bantu languages. And the thing is, languages are very arbitrary units. The reason these are different languages is because different missionaries settled there and standardized the language. That's how dialects became languages in Africa. There were actually similar processes in Europe, maybe without the missionaries. So these are the areas where missionaries managed to carve out their congregations reading the same version of the Bible, and that helped standardize the language, and those became the ethnic units that the government decided had been ordained by God, and also all black people were forced to relate to the government through those ethnic units. So they put this gloss over the map, and then they categorized all of the units together according to their ethnic definition. There could have been 1, there could have been 3, there could have been 50. They chose 8, and later on they figured, no, we really have 10. And I always think that's a bit curious, because if it's divinely ordained, okay, so here they are, all the different ethnic groups and their sizes and where their zones were. Yeah, okay, so, and then this was called separate development, and it became a political theology. God has given a divine task and calling to every people, folk in the world, which dare not be denied or destroyed by anyone. Their second principle is every individual has the inherent right to live and develop. And it's their deep conviction that the personal and national ideals of every ethnic group can best be developed within its own national community. So here you've got the segregation coming. It's only within your ethnic community you can develop, and your ethnic community has to be segregated from other ethnic communities. This is the philosophical basis of the policy of apartheid. This comes out of neo-Calvinism. To our people, it is not a mere abstraction which hangs in the air. It is a divine task which has to be implemented and fulfilled systematically. Now, I want to stop here and pause, and I want to remind you that segregation existed in South Africa before 1948 and existed before anyone developed this theology. I want to say that my graduate education made me appreciate Marx, and I fully understand the importance of capitalism in creating this system, and none of that went away. There were still really strong economic motives. We can't blame apartheid on this theology. We can say this is what was legitimizing it, and it also changed the experience of segregated people in very real ways. So these are the 10 homelands, all for their ethnic groups, and they're not at all contiguous. KwaZulu was in 70 pieces. Bophuthatswana was in, which received independence, I'll tell you about in a minute, was in 7 different pieces. They're all separated by what was considered white South Africa. All this is happening at the same time that Africa is decolonizing. And the government took a page from that, and a bit of inspiration, and started to frame this segregation and investing these ethnic units with being the political units, and they started to talk about that as being a move of decolonization. This is the foreign minister. Our policy is not based on any concepts of superiority or inferiority, but on the historical fact that different people differ in their loyalties, customs, outlooks, modes of life. This division came about naturally and historically. We believe the objective of self-determination for all our people. So they started to claim that these ethnic units were actually self-governing. And not only that, they made the move of actually granting some of them independence. So the ones that are colored blue are the ones that the South African government declared were independent. The rest of the world did not recognize this at all. So they exchanged ambassadors with each other. So if you were traveling in these really poor areas of South Africa, you could see limousines with flags from the ambassador from Venda was going to see the government of Bophuthatswana. They had this whole fiction. The best part of all of this is that at the independence ceremony for the Transkei in 1976, they raised the flag on the flagpole, and the flagpole fell down. This was a complete sham. It was a complete sham, but the human costs of it were enormous. The human costs were territorial consolidation removals. So this is kind of a neat map. The spots are larger than they had been, but in 1913 and 1936, that 13% of the land, black people were on a lot more than 13% of the land. Only 13% was actually given to them. And so by the time you get to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when the government is really invested in independence and self-government, they decide they have to clean up what they call black spots. That's what they called them. So they started to remove people, forcibly remove people, in order to put them in these larger units. Even those units aren't contiguous. So these are the numbers of people who were removed. There was a group called the Surplus People Project, and there were mostly white, a lot of women, intellectuals, a lot of historians who decided they were going to use their skills to document what was going on. And they left us this wonderful resource where they documented all the removals they saw happening. And so, I don't have my dates here, but this is through the 60s and the 70s. They counted that 3,548,900 people were removed forcibly, meaning the government came in with trucks, picked them up. Actually, some of them moved. Some of them might have moved just because they were convinced to go. But when it got to the end, those who were not moving, the government would come in with trucks, pick them up, bulldoze their homes, and take them and drop them out in a rural area. And by the time, as this process continued, the government had stopped really preparing the rural area, wasn't really building houses or even providing much water for these areas. The human costs were tremendous. So we've got 3.5 million people being moved. The total black population in 1960 is 10 million, about 11 million. In 1980 it goes up to 20 million. So there are a documented 3.5 million removals in a population of this size. I'll tell you though, some of those people were moved more than once. Okay, so, and this is where I need 14 more weeks to end, and this is where I don't have a graceful ending. I've told you about thinking historically in a broken world, but I've also told you about thinking historically about a broken Christianity. And it's fair to say this was really a gripping issue among some people at Calvin in the 1980s, and we thought a lot about it. And I continue to think about it. I went into graduate school in African Studies and African History. So I can't tell you about the end of apartheid. I've told you about the human cost. I've told you about the theological justification. I've given you an example of history in a very broken world. I guess the thing I'll tell you last is in 1983, Alan Boesak, who'd been at Calvin, went back to South Africa, and there he is with Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu was always laughing. He had the best laugh. And they and some other people founded what was known as the United Democratic Front, which became a front for the ANC in exile, and they mobilized the population. It was a big tent organization. People of all stripes who were against apartheid joined together and worked against it. And they were successful, and it was really exciting. It was really exciting to see, and it was exciting for us here at Calvin to see what where Alan Boesak had gone. And he was a liberation theologian who identified as a Calvinist. And in the end, Mandela was released in 1990, and the election was in 1994. And with that overly neat ending, I will turn it over to Jeremy.
This is a quote from a letter that a senior executive at Oxfam, the British NGO Oxfam, which really had its breakthrough moment in this era in the response to Biafra, wrote to the British journal The Spectator in 1968. And it talks about frustration at our inability to get significant quantities of supplies in. Despair because we know large-scale operation must be mounted in the next few days, or the problem will resolve itself because people will die. Disappointment at the government's refusal to allow a land corridor, even supervised by the Red Cross, until a ceasefire is agreed. All of that could be written, and in various forms has been written about Gaza over the last several years. All of the same issues. But this is 1968, and this is Nigeria. When I've taught a class at Georgetown on humanitarian field operations 6 or 7 times now, and when I was planning the syllabus, and I had no idea when I agreed to teach the class what goes into planning a syllabus, and I don't ever want to do it again. But I have it, good. So just going to keep getting mileage out of that thing. When I tried to think what do I want to share with students about this, well, I was a history major and a classics major, and almost a French minor, but not quite. So I tend to approach things historically, and I want to understand the historical context and the backdrop. How did we get to where we are now? How does that help us understand and contextualize where we are now? And so I wanted to leave my students with a sense of the kind of historical scope of humanitarian action. And when you read the history of humanitarian responses over the years, one thing that comes through very clearly is that none of the problems that we encounter in contemporary responses are new or different. We've seen all of these problems before. They're kind of inherent to the nature of navigating humanitarian access and humanitarian action in contested spaces, whether that's contested politically or contested violently through conflict. And so going back to Biafra is very interesting because it's kind of the patient zero of the types of humanitarian obstruction that we continue to see routinely in many, many crises and responses up to the present day. So not many people, well, at least not many people in my generation, know or remember much of Biafra. It was about a decade before I was born, and you know, it's kind of faded into history, but it's actually a really fascinating case. So just to quickly set the scene of how that crisis emerged. So Nigeria gained its independence in 1960, and had a coup in 1966 that placed Igbo officers, that's a predominantly Christian ethnic group in Nigeria, in charge of the country, and then there was a counter coup soon thereafter that toppled him. And that touched off a wave of anti-Igbo pogroms across the country that killed between 80 and 100,000 people. And there is an amazing book called Half a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is an amazing, amazing read about this era, a fictionalized account of this era that I highly recommend to everyone. And so in the wake of those pogroms, Igbo from across the country fled to the south, where they were the dominant group in Biafra. And in response to those pogroms, and in part because much of the oil wealth of Nigeria was in and around Biafra, they then attempted to secede from Nigeria. And that touched off a 3-year civil war in which we saw many of the tactics of obstructing humanitarian action that we continue to see in places like Syria and Gaza and Sudan and many, many other places today. Over the course of the war, the death toll is estimated at anywhere from 1 to 2 million people. Most of those did not die from conflict violence directly, they died from famine and disease. And they died from famine and disease because the Nigerian government put a full blockade, or attempted to put a full blockade around Biafra, and also obstruct not just commercial activity, but also any aid from getting in. And that touched off a major humanitarian crisis, and in turn, helped to give birth to what we now know as the modern aid system. So in response to the government blocking aid and blocking trade, which of course they did to put pressure on the secessionist leadership, it is a very similar logic, it's the same logic, that prompted the Israeli defense minister 3 days after the horrific attacks of October 7 to announce a total blockade on Gaza. And the logic was to punish and put pressure on a population, and not to discriminate between military and civilian, but just to apply it to the totality of the population, to use deprivation, starvation, and generalized abuse to make it impossible for, to basically advance the military and security aims of the government. And so within about a year, the food stocks that had been in the area were depleted and starvation was emerging. And this became a huge global cause, and aid budgets exploded. So prior to this, there were some charity groups. Save the Children had dated to the first half of the 20th century. CARE International came out of the CARE packages that were distributed during World War II. But they were kind of small. They were not large, ongoing enterprises. Biafra really ramped up the scale and the funding of humanitarian response organizations. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, one of the largest relief groups in the world, its budget just for Biafra was triple what its previous budget for the whole world had been. So this was prompting humanitarian action on a whole different scale than the world had really seen, certainly since the Second World War. But the Nigerian government considered that to be contrary to its aims in the war, and did not consent. And under international humanitarian law, there is a certain ambiguity, which I spend a fair amount of time on in the rest of this lecture when I give a full lecture in class. But basically, under international law, a government has to consent to aid delivery in its territory, but it does not have the legal authority to withhold that consent arbitrarily. So if it arbitrarily withholds consent, which is what the Israeli government has done in Gaza and what the Nigerian government very much did here, that is not lawful. And so it created this kind of legal gray zone in which aid groups had to operate. The Nigerian government tried to force them to withdraw. Some of them complied with that, including the Red Cross. Other aid groups said, no, we're not going to do that, and began doing clandestine aid deliveries. And so if any of you have heard of the Irish NGO Concern started in this era as an organization doing clandestine night flights of aid delivery into Biafra from neighboring countries around the Nigerian government blockade. If you've heard of Doctors Without Borders, probably most of you have heard of it because it's the most famous NGO in the world. Doctors Without Borders was founded because of this very issue. So there were doctors working for the Red Cross who were very frustrated that the Red Cross decided to comply with the mandate of the Nigerian government to halt aid deliveries and only deliver when they consented. And so they thought that was illegitimate, they thought that was indefensible, but it was very rooted in the Red Cross's understanding of itself as a neutral entity. And the way they applied that neutrality and continue to apply that neutrality up to the present day was basically, we need everyone's consent to do anything. And what that does over and over and over in the history of the Red Cross is give effective veto power to some very bad actors about whether the Red Cross can actually deliver in their territories or not. And MSF was founded, Doctors Without Borders was founded out of this idea that that's kind of stupid. We shouldn't give governments who are trying to obstruct aid permission to do so. We shouldn't just go along with that. And so I'm going to draw on my French minor here, the founding ethos of MSF was soigner et témoigner, which is to aid and to witness. And that remains their ethos up to today. And so over the course of, you see the split within the humanitarian response and the growth of these NGOs, emergence of these NGOs, responding to the obstructionism of the Nigerian government and the policy of very explicit starvation by the Nigerian government. And they mount a massive clandestine relief air bridge, which at the time was the largest ever humanitarian airlift. Another fascinating dimension of all this was the battle to control the narrative. And this too really resonates in the present day. So if you think about, I spend way too much of my life on Twitter. For those of you who do the same, I'm sorry. But if you do that, you will see a ton of effort by the Israeli government and by allies of the Israeli government to push out the government's preferred narrative about humanitarian issues in Gaza. So this, for example, when there was a declaration of famine in Gaza last summer, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk. If anyone's really interested in the technical backstop to that, it was a very credible and I think valid determination. And it was also very politically damaging to the Israeli government to be responsible for a famine. And so there was a huge and furious pushback by the Israeli government, by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and by pro-Israel think tanks in the United States, including one that shares my building in Washington, trying to falsify and raise doubt about the famine determination. Well, there are roots of that in Biafra. So the Biafran leadership really understood that they would not win this by military means alone. And I should say, ultimately, they did not win it. They were defeated and reintegrated into Nigeria after the war ended. But they knew that militarily they were not going to win. So the only way they could win was by gaining the world's sympathy and winning diplomatically what they could not win on the battlefield. And so they went to great lengths to build a global narrative sympathetic to their cause and a global movement sympathetic to their cause, including going to the lengths of hiring a public relations firm in Geneva to push news stories that were sympathetic to Biafran secessionism. Missionary groups in Biafra mobilized their church contacts around the world to organize aid deliveries and also to raise awareness with their congregations in particularly English-speaking countries. And there was a real watershed moment then in 1968 when UK newspapers got into Biafra and published photos, including this one, of the starvation that was resulting from the Nigerian military's blockade of the territory. And though this was pre-CNN, it is an early version of what we would now call the CNN effect. It grabbed the world's attention in a massive way and became really the first, this is the early era, not so early, but kind of this is basically the first televised famine in the world. And that medium between the widespread of these photos and some of the television coverage, it just takes global awareness of this, again, particularly in Western northern countries, to a very unprecedented level. And all of that is, that is in part by design. The Biafran secessionists are trying to get that outcome because that narrative control is fundamental to their political strategy. And all of this creates huge dilemmas for aid groups. So this is the letter that I quoted at the beginning in The Spectator, ran in The Spectator under the headline, "Must Biafra Starve?" So the Nigerian government very, very explicitly viewed aid as counter to their goals and as support for the secessionist cause. So they looked at the NGOs not as neutral actors, but as partial actors, as partisans of the secessionists. The NGOs, some of them may have seen themselves that way, but really did not frame their activities in political terms. They framed their activities in humanitarian terms. But it's undeniable that the famine imagery was useful to the secessionists, and the humanitarian response and the outreach by humanitarian groups and the awareness raising by humanitarian groups and the mobilization that they led was politically useful to the secessionists. And so aid groups reacted very differently to this. ICRC, which has this very firm ethos of neutrality and confidentiality, and the logic behind that is that they can get access to places that they would not have access to if they talked more openly about what they see. And sometimes that is a useful thing. There are times when having that sort of quiet behind-the-scenes dialogue with the government is worth the cost of your silence. There are times when it is not. ICRC famously did not talk about what it saw in German concentration camps during the Second World War. They did not talk. They did not talk about what they saw in Biafra and did not run counter to the government. And you had then a lot of NGOs that sprung up in reaction to that. Concern, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, and that backlash is a really seminal moment in the creation of the international humanitarian sector. Many of the leading humanitarian organizations around the world that we still have with us today kind of came out of that primordial soup of the Biafra response. And so we see these echoes of the response in Biafra all the way through to the present day in Gaza, and in many, many other crises over the years as well. So you see starvation and aid obstruction as explicit military tactics. One interesting difference, though, is how open the Nigerian government was about this. So the Nigerian government was very explicit. Yes, they were putting a blockade on Biafra, and yes, they were doing it as part of their war effort. The Israeli government officially will maintain that's not the case. But they are using the same tactic, but they are not, they also know that it's not really the done thing in this day and age to just admit that. It was a CNN emergency in the pre-CNN era. It also shaped huge global activism. So this is a photo in London. Sorry, no, not London. I think this is actually in the Netherlands. This is a photo, what's that?
The Hague.
The Hague, thank you. This is a photo in The Hague. Thank you, Frans. I knew the Dutch was there. I didn't know which city. So this is a photo of a Biafra protest in The Hague in the 60s. And this is a photo of a Gaza protest in London in the present era. Both of these were massive international causes. And that visibility, that political salience elevated the relief response. So governments that had very little actual interest in the welfare of anyone living in Biafra suddenly had to deal with this as a political issue because of that mobilization. There was also a huge debate over famine and genocide accusations, as there has been on Gaza. There was indisputably a famine in Biafra, and the Nigerian government was clearly causing that. Western governments did not really want to be confronted with that or acknowledge it. And throughout the war, actually, the British government was in the main on the side of the Nigerian military. And I had a very interesting conversation a few weeks ago with someone who worked for Irish Concern in this era, who talked about some of the Concern NGO leadership actually being monitored by British MI6 because they were seen as operating contrary to the British foreign policy in Nigeria. And as I've talked about already, these differing ethical approaches of different aid groups. So in that era, it was ICRC and MSF. Well, MSF came out of it, what became MSF. In the present day, there are very different philosophies amongst some of the groups operating in Gaza about how to deal with the obstruction by the Israeli government. Some are quite confrontational. Some try to some tried mostly unsuccessfully, to position themselves as kind of non-confrontational, non-adversarial towards the aid policy, the aid obstruction of the government. None are terribly successful at getting large-scale aid in, regardless of what approach they take. And I think one of the moments that within the aid community was very notable was the April 2024 strike on World Central Kitchen. So World Central Kitchen had been, and it's an organization that does a lot of good work, and I have a lot of respect for it, but they were, within the kind of constellation of aid groups in Gaza, they were one that very explicitly went out of their way to build a non-adversarial relationship with the Israeli government, and it did not protect them. And so I think it's helpful and important to understand this, because we see these patterns recur over and over and over. I talked about Biafra and Gaza here. I could just as easily have talked about Syria. I could have just as easily talked about Sudan, South Sudan, many, many other crises over the years. And so what I tell my students is it's important to understand this, because you need to understand what you're seeing when you see these patterns. When the Israeli government is doing this, they are drawing on a long and rich history of government obstruction of aid efforts. And it's also why, notwithstanding my respect for World Central Kitchen, why I think efforts to take a non-combative, non-confrontational, non-adversarial approach to that don't have a great track record. Because ultimately, when a government is obstructing aid, when a government is willing to turn itself into an international pariah in order to starve people, it's very hard to get on their good side and make yourself a non-adversarial actor so that you can maintain your access. And the history of groups being able to parlay that into sustained, effective humanitarian access is not great. And in the case of Biafra, the groups that took that approach did not get that much aid in, and they were obstructed at every turn. And that is why we now have the modern NGO sector that we have today. So I think it's important to understand that history and those lessons, because for the past few years it's been Gaza and Sudan. 5 or 10 more years down the line it will be somewhere else, but we will continue to see these patterns. And it's important, when I'm teaching students who I hope will become humanitarian operators, it's important that they understand when they begin to run into this, what they're seeing and what it's likely to mean.
We'd love to hear your questions. We'd love to hear questions from students. Can I pause and say, let's take a question from the students. I'm going to put pressure on you. But could we have a question from the students before we go on? Is there anything you'd like to share, to comment even? I'll get back. Yes, would you like to? Sorry, do I have one?
I was just going to say good talks.
Oh, that's appreciated. Thank you. Do you have a point?
Yes.
So in regards to reactions to apartheid in the United States, what were things like in your personal experience during the period?
I left Calvin and went to UCLA. And at UCLA, there was a really active anti-apartheid movement. And I remember going to the rallies, and it was really energizing. They were looking for divestment. And there was a big movement in favor of that. And actually, the US Congress passed a bill for sanctions against South Africa. Ronald Reagan vetoed it, and they overrode that veto. So, I mean, that was really unusual. So there was a really strong movement against apartheid, and a lot of it led by the civil rights veterans. So that was actually a really inspirational time. Okay, so students, we'd love. Oh, do we have another? Do you have a question?
I guess so. Like apartheid was very much the fight for civil rights in the United States. So we notice how did those intersect during that time?
Well, I'll tell you that in the 1950s there was a tremendous grassroots uprising, I won't say uprising, but grassroots protests against apartheid, nonviolent protests, long before civil rights really took off in the United States. So everyone's always wondering how civil rights influenced them, but they were really doing those sorts of protests before anyone was doing them in the United States. After 1960, however, black political expression was banned in South Africa, and the ANC was forced to go underground and into exile. So when the civil rights movement really picked up in the United States, there was a lot of communication with the ANC in exile and communications with South Africans, but it was completely impossible to continue that kind of activity in the 1960s. And the ANC then went to an armed struggle and military action. We can open the floor to questions for anyone now. Oh, yes.
How did the CRC respond to theological justifications for apartheid using a lot of Calvinistic principles?
Well, they invited Alan Boesak, and definitely the criticism on this campus was strong, but I don't remember what the CRC itself did. Does anybody remember?
We called it a heresy.
Excellent. Can you tell us more about that?
Not really. I just remember it was a great debate at Synod. And Nick Walterstorff was very invested and involved in, and a number of people from the Christian Reformed Church went there and tried to have conversations with leaders in South Africa and weren't as successful as they wanted to be. But I think they called it a heresy.
Theological justification.
David, do you remember?
The Synod declared the theological justification of apartheid to be a heresy. Apartheid was declared to be a sin. 1984.
When was this?
1984, he says.
I think it was 19. I think I was a member of that Synod.
They also broke relations with churches.
It took a while then.
I think so.
Well, I think Alan Boesak being here was really important, and Nick Walterstorff was really important.
Jeremy, you talked about how the Biafra was very proactive about almost promoting their own cause, and especially relying on the Christian identity to sort of get Christians in other countries to maybe be on their side, care about sending them humanitarian aid. Can you talk a little bit about how religion has factored into the Gaza humanitarian debates, and also about how there has or hasn't been some of that similar grassroots effort to promote their own cause abroad?
That's a really interesting question. So, one of the things that you see occasionally is that when there is a very clear us versus them division along religious lines, that is very useful for mobilizing activism. So, South Sudan and Sudan, there was a lot of Christian activism in the 90s and 2000s around South Sudanese independence. And much of it was framed around South Sudanese are Christian, North Sudanese are Muslim as a wild oversimplification, but it was useful for mobilization. And I think it is much, it's not at all clean cut when it comes to Israel-Palestine issues. There are, the majority of Palestinians are Muslim, but there's a sizable minority of Christians. There were Christian communities in Gaza. There are still Christian communities in Gaza. One of the most controversial moments in the war was when a Catholic, I believe it was a Catholic, or maybe it was a Greek Orthodox, or an Orthodox church that was serving as a shelter for displaced people was struck by an Israeli military attack. Justin Amash, who is the former member of Congress for this part of Michigan, his family are Palestinian Christians. They still have family in, I believe, in Gaza, and he had relatives, and so he would occasionally tweet about what his relatives were reporting about what they were experiencing. And I think what you see in a lot of what I'll call anti-Palestinian rhetoric and demagoguery is really an erasure of Palestinian Christians, because it's very inconvenient for that kind of narrative. There is a deep well of Islamophobia that runs underneath much of that that attempts to erase Palestinian identity. And Doug Howard is here, from whom I learned about much of that when I was a student at Kellogg. Those attempts, there's a pretty tight overlap in the Venn diagram between attempts to erase Palestinian identity and broader Islamophobia. And Palestinian Christians very much complicate that narrative. And you'll occasionally see, because there are evangelical Christians in the US who are deeply, deeply pro-Israel, who really don't want to contend with that at all. And will occasionally even talk about how the Christian Palestinians are under threat from the Muslim Palestinians. And then every time you see something like that, there will be a chorus of Palestinian Christians who say, well, actually, the far greater threat to us is the Israeli government, the Israeli military. So I think as activism and mobilization, it hasn't factored in as much, but there is also a very, I think, concerted desire and attempt to suppress that part of the narrative.
Sorry. Thank you both for being here. My question for you, or is for you, Jeremy. Referencing your past work for USAID, what steps could be taken to bring USAID back, and how much goodwill do you think has been lost or how much goodwill has the U.S. lost internationally by deleting that program?
I did not plant that question. Maybe before we get to how much goodwill, just how much good has been lost. So, U.S. foreign policy is a complicated thing. USAID is a complicated thing. And there was a lot, one of the more frustrating aspects of the attack on USAID a year ago, in a sea of many very frustrating and infuriating things, were these accusations that somehow the people who worked there were a rogue agency pursuing their own woke foreign policy and out of step with goals of the State Department and so on. Ironically, by the way, many of the programs that were pointed to as justification of that line of attack were actually State Department funded programs picked by State Department ambassadors, but we won't get into that right now. So it's a complicated thing, and there's always a degree of kind of trade-off and hypocrisy and kind of mixed feelings. But what I think USAID was very important, in part as a conscience within American foreign policy. And I had the privilege many times of sitting in the Situation Room during policy deliberations around Yemen, around Iraq. I served as the lead for disaster response at USAID from 2013 to 2017, so most of the second Obama term. So counter-ISIL period, Syria period, many. Our function at the table was very often to try and be the conscience within the process. And I think that is partly why, or in large measure why, USAID was targeted. This is a foreign policy without a conscience, that is proud to be a foreign policy without a conscience. It is very proudly an amoral foreign policy. Elon Musk, when he was running rampage through USAID, was very explicit in saying that he thought empathy was a weakness. And if there's anything that USAID aspired to represent in the world, it was an empathetic side of American leadership. And when John Kennedy founded USAID, it was very explicitly to both advance America's interests in the world and demonstrate American benevolence to the world. And seeing the demonstration of American benevolence in its own right as a strong US interest in our foreign policy. And that's what we've lost. And in losing that, what we lose is 20 million lives that have been saved from HIV. What we risk losing is the hundreds of thousands to millions of people who are kept alive every year by US food aid. In the last year of the Biden administration, total US humanitarian spending in the world was $14 billion. Just for reference, Elon Musk's net worth over the past year has increased by $300 billion, so about 20 times as much as that. That dropped to less than $4 billion last year. So $10 billion completely out, gone. And that is food out of mouths, that is medicine, that is vaccines out of arms, and that's just the humanitarian piece. If you expand that to global health, development, nutrition, other things, it's even worse. So it did a lot of good in the world. I do think it can come back. I don't think it should come back in exactly the way it existed before. And one of the great ironies of the Doging of USAID was that if Doge had gone into USAID and just said to the staff, hey, we're throwing the rule book out the window. What can we fix? Oh my goodness, there would have been so many things it could have fixed. No one knows better what needed fixing at USAID than the people who worked at USAID. But that was, they were the enemy, and so that was not the approach. But I think it needs to come back. I think it needs to come back because the State Department, it's a wonderful institution. They're not good at foreign aid, and they're going to make a hash of it over the next several years. But more, I think more importantly than the effectiveness argument is the moral argument. The purpose of USAID in the world was to signify that America could lead not just with power but also with values. And by folding USAID into the State Department, by folding foreign aid into the State Department, that will be lost. That is being lost, and that will be lost. And so I think it's a very important. For a future administration. And by the way, traditionally USAID has had a lot of bipartisan support. It's not been a heavily partisan institution. I think it will be important for a future administration, if it wants to make a break with what we are seeing, the chaos that we're seeing U.S. foreign policy now bring to the world. There's probably no more powerful way to symbolize that than by undoing and reversing the assault on USAID. I have lots of ideas about how to build it better and differently than it was before. Any institution that's been around for 60 years shows its age, and USAID certainly did. So I wouldn't want to just restore the status quo ante, but it should come back.
Jeremy, I don't need a microphone, but can you talk a little bit about the early history of this USAID? Because in my study of the political assassinations in the 1960s, it's often, seen as an arm of the CIA, but that's not the State Department, and it was very imperialistic, colonialistic, And talking to my brother last night, who's a very erudite scholar, and he was saying that part that was in there in the 60s, well, also it was another layer for killing Kennedy, which I believe he was killed because of his foreign policy. But another layer of that would be to get rid of ASID or handle it in colonial imperialistic ways. And he thinks that there's still a part of USAID that is in that camp, the colonialistic camp. So if you could talk about the early history, please. Thanks.
Sure. I don't know the early history extremely well, but certainly a lot of what USAID did in those early years was in Vietnam, and so this is why when I talk about the somewhat conflicted and occasionally hypocritical nature of U.S. foreign aid, I'm thinking of things like the Strategic Villages initiatives in Vietnam, which USAID had a role in. I'm thinking of things like the just vast amounts of funding that were wasted on stupid programs in Iraq and Afghanistan after the wars there. I can't speak much to what the internal deliberations within USAID were like in that era in the 60s. I can talk, and because I knew more of what was going on more recently in the post 9/11 wars and the global war on terror era. And for the most part, when USAID was funding really stupid and counterproductive programs, which they absolutely did in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was often because they were being railroaded into that either by the military or by the State Department. And by people who were not aid professionals and didn't really understand what aid could and could not achieve. And took a very transactional, as we're seeing currently, took a very transactional view of foreign aid. So, okay, we need to get the Pakistan government on side, so we're going to do this thing that they want us to do. Never mind whether that is a viable, sustainable initiative, never mind whether that is a good idea, never mind whether that is something the government wants, but perhaps not the population of the area. USAID would try to raise these things and usually get overruled. And look, at the end of the day, it was a government agency. And this is where, the people that I knew and the colleagues that I worked with there, for the most part, knew that these would be stupid ideas. But at the end of the day, they were also public servants, and there was a very strong ethos that you were a government employee. And you were not running your own foreign policy, and so at the end of the day, when the order came down from on high of what you were to do, you did it. And you say your piece, you make the best argument you can. You don't always win. And I think what we're going to see now, and one of the reasons I'm quite pessimistic about what we're going to see out of the State Department, is there was institutional weight within USAID and the kind of role that USAID could play in the policy process, the foreign policy process, to try and push back on the stupid ideas. When I worked at USAID, we would jokingly call that the office of bad ideas. So when kind of dumb ideas were coming down, we gotta go do a showing at the office of bad ideas. And what we'll have now is you still have that same impulse to use aid, or to try to use aid and instrumentalize aid in ways that are ultimately ineffective as assistance, and potentially also pretty counterproductive in policy. And you're not going to have the counterweight to that. USAID was not a perfect counterweight to that, but it was something of a counterweight to that, and that's now gone. See it's long enough?
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, John.
Did the South Africans take inspiration from U.S. Jim Crow laws like the Nazis did?
John's my brother-in-law. Hi, Mayor.
Hi, Dan.
Here's my sister. I guess white supremacy was a global phenomenon, still is. And these folks were always taking inspiration from each other. Offhand, I can't, I know, in my international studies, I think more about the ANC talking to the civil rights movement. I'm trying to think if they took inspiration. I don't think I've seen that, but I have to say that there was just this global milieu that like-minded people were always in contact with each other and generally taking inspiration. Maybe it wasn't directly citing particular laws, but this was definitely a global conversation. Yeah, thanks.